Now we travel southward from Mesoamerica to the Andes to look at the beginnings of Andean civilization in South America. Lectures 34 and 35 cover the subject according to the altitude of the civilizations. In this lecture, we look at the civilizations of the coast. And then, in the second lecture, we look at the civilizations of the highlands and culminate with the Inca civilization. We begin by defining two poles of Andean civilization. The one on Peru's north coast, the other in the south-central Andes. Then we survey a popular theory which argues that coastal civilization originated in part because of the rich Pacific fisheries nurtured by the Humboldt Current close offshore, which produced huge food surpluses. Then I'll describe the early ceremonial centers erected by scattered rural communities, which are the first signs of the emergence of civilization. We analyze the Chavin cult, an art style and religious beliefs mark this cult, which spread widely on the coast and in the highlands between 900 and 200 BC. Finally, we'll describe the flamboyant Moche state of the north coast, which flourished from about 200 BC to AD 600, before being weakened and destroyed in part by a series of natural disasters. In AD 1500, the vast Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, extended from high in the Andes mountains, through dry highland plains, to foothills, tropical forests, and coastal deserts, some of the driest terrain on Earth. Millions of people lived under Inca rule, ruled from the Inca capital at Cusco, high in the Andes, the inheritors of a tradition of civilization which extended back more than 3,000 years. In this lecture, number 34, we discuss the origins of Andean civilization, the very basis of this long, long history of civilization. We start on the coast, we look at the foothills as well. And then in the next lecture, lecture 35, I'll examine the predecessors of Inca civilization and the formation of the extraordinary Inca Empire and some of its institutions. Over many centuries, two poles of Andean civilization developed. The one was centered along the north coast of modern-day Peru, one of the driest environments on Earth. The other was in the south-central Andes mountains. They were two poles, but only the Inca succeeded in unifying them into a single kingdom, a single empire. But, and this is a very important, persistent theme of Andean civilization, societies on both poles of civilization interacted and traded with each other constantly. They had to, because both needed commodities grown or produced by the other. The north pole of civilization in the Andes was centered on the virtually rainless coastal desert, where over 40 rivers and streams, fueled by mountain runoff, dissect the arid coastal plain. They are rather like the Nile, a set of arrows which flow through the dry landscape, watered by spring mountain runoff. Human populations from the very beginning, the very first settlement, thousands of years earlier, had settled in these valleys, most notably in the Chicama-Moche area and in the Lambayeque region, where there were river valleys which ultimately were intensively irrigated by farmers. The Pacific coast was the key to much settlement along this area, because close offshore there were rich anchovy fisheries. A Humboldt current brought rich fisheries to the coast, which were fostered and fertilized by cold water upwelling from the depths of the ocean close offshore. This produced an incredible bounty of food, not all the time, but most of the time. The southern pole of Andean civilization embraced the Altiplano, the high-altitude grasslands around Lake Titicaca. The Puna grasslands of this region supported large herds of alpacas and llamas. This was a very different environment. As a result of this startlingly diverse topography and great environmental diversity, Andean civilization developed along many pathways, creating a highly varied mosaic of kingdoms, states, and empires, which shared many common beliefs. The north coast of Peru is arid, demanding terrain. Yet it was here that the first Andean civilizations appear to have developed. Now, cultivation of any sort in this area depended on runoff from the Andes. And this runoff had to be carefully steered towards fields, the water conserved and distributed with the greatest of care and skill. It's unlikely that a civilization would have developed and flourished in this area without something else. And the something else was the richest fisheries in the Americas, which lay close offshore, yielding millions of small schooling fish, such as anchovies. These anchovies would not only be cooked and eaten, but were also turned into nourishing fish meal. And the harvest from these fisheries, and especially the fish meal, supported thousands of people in coastal river valleys. And not only that, it was exported to the highlands. One of the advantages of fish meal is relatively light, and it could be carried up to the highlands where there was a constant need for protein. A well-known Andean archaeologist, Michael Mosley, believes that the unique maritime resources of the Pacific coast were the key to civilization. He believes that the anchovy fisheries, and there were 19th century accounts of people literally picking fish up with baskets, not even fishing, from boats or even on the shore, that this remarkable fishery provided sufficient food surpluses to free up time and people for other activities. Ritual activities, erecting large monuments like adobe pyramids or temples, and also provided enough food to support a growing number of people who were neither farmers or fisherfolk. He argues that the anchovy harvests alone were sufficient to support more people than lived along the coast in ancient times. Mosley's maritime foundations hypothesis was developed in the 1970s, and it has stood the test of time remarkably well, which is a great compliment to Mosley, because most academic theories these days have rather short lives. But the maritime foundations hypothesis has been criticized. It's been criticized because it places such an enormous emphasis on fishing. And it argues that Mosley did not take account of a natural phenomenon, an irregular natural phenomenon along the coast, which could decimate the fisheries. That, of course, is El Niño, the Christmas child, as it's called. El Niños were first identified by scientists in the 19th century. They were identified as a result of startling fluctuations in the amount of guano produced by seabirds off the Peruvian coast. Now, it may be news to you to learn that Peruvian bird fertilizer is the finest nitrogen-rich natural fertilizer in the world. And during the 19th century, the Peruvian government exported millions of dollars worth of this lightweight, very good fertilizer, very smelly fertilizer, to North America and especially to Europe. But there were years when the seabirds vanished and there was no guano production. And for years the scientists wondered why. And then, in the 1890s, they finally got round to asking the local fishermen. And the local fishermen looked at us as if they're crazy and said, it's El Nino, the Christmas child. And they pointed out that somewhere around every 7 years, and the interval, as you know, is variable, a countercurrent, a warm one from the tropics, came down, bringing alien fish, stopped the upwelling so there were no anchovies, and the seabirds followed the anchovies further south into Chile. And then, after a year or so, the pattern reversed back to normal. The result was a decimation, temporarily, of the coastal fisheries. And people argued that Moseley's hypothesis was wrong because of these fluctuations. But in the long term, I think you can counter by saying that the fishery produced such enormous surpluses that probably some of the impact of El Niños was mitigated. Also, that isn't to say there were no fish in the ocean, and they certainly caught other species. So I believe that Moseley's hypothesis has merit, especially since farming communities in the highlands needed not only fish meal, but also seaweed and salt to complement their carbohydrate diet, to combat such conditions as goiter. And the result was there was this interdependence between coastal and highland communities. And for example, you couldn't grow a root potato, a crop like the potato, which is the Andean crop in the highlands, in the lowlands. So there was this constant interaction right through history between highlands and lowlands. Now, this focus on marine resources, goes the Foundation's argument, led to the formation of large, densely concentrated populations in major river valleys. The leaders of these communities and these populations were able, because of the food surpluses, to organize large labor forces to build elaborate ceremonial centers using adobe brick. And as crops began to be cultivated on the coast, the same labor forces were also used to create the irrigation works needed to allow intensive cultivation of the fertile river valley soils. So, Moseley argued the combination of a maritime diet, maize agriculture, and remember that maize was introduced here about 1800 BC or so, and trade provided impetus for major changes in coastal society. And this was the moment all these factors came together, so that after 1800 BC, a series of competing kingdoms developed along the north and central coast of Peru, concentrated on those river valleys where irrigation was possible. In these valleys, sedentary, permanent villages housed several hundred people each and were home to skilled weavers, people who were weaving cotton grown in these low-lying, warm valleys, the start of a long and flamboyant Andean cultural tradition. And in fact, the designs on textiles provided a really major way of communicating basic iconographies of civilization. This initial period, as it's called, of Andean civilization saw an elaboration of ritual life and the appearance of new forms of religious architecture. For example, there's a site called El Paraiso on the Chilon River, which is a large U-shaped ceremonial site built in about 1800 BC. This comprises at least 6 huge buildings of plastered boulders painted in brilliant hues. It's in a U shape. Then there's another site, Huaca, Florida, on the Rio Rimac, 8 miles inland from El Paraiso, which was built a century later. This was even larger, with an adobe and boulder platform 840 feet long and 180 feet wide, towering 100 feet above the densely irrigated land which once surrounded it. Now, what's interesting is that these structures were built not by city dwellers, but by people from many surrounding communities. For thousands of years, hunter-gatherer communities had lived mainly at the coast. Why? Because of the extremely productive fisheries, and also because of the clumps of plant foods which grew near the mouths of the rivers in the damp, foggy environment right at the coast. But by now, the focus of settlement had changed. People had moved from the coast inland at a time when irrigation agriculture was coming into widespread use. Michael Mosley believes that irrigation required a major reorganization of labor, and that this reorganization, and clearly you're really going to alter society if you're going to get into large-scale agriculture, coincided with new artistic traditions and religious architecture. Here again, you're dealing with the relationship between the living and the spiritual worlds. And one of the ways that the Andeans did this was to ritually manipulate smoke and water, a way of bridging the stratified layers they believed in of air, earth, and bodies of water, the Andean cosmos. It is believed that these vast open courts of coastal U-shaped ceremonial complexes may have housed sacred gardens and orchards irrigated with specially manipulated water supplies. Water here was the staff of life. As irrigation assumed greater importance, so growing communities turned from informally organized land reclamation to highly structured irrigation works controlled by a central authority with powerful religious connections. Sitchin Alto in the Casma Valley was built in 1400 BC, a huge U-shaped ceremonial complex with sunken courts, plazas, and flanking mounds. Again, public performance was very much part of Andean civilization, like it was of Mesoamerican. But what kingdoms and what leaders controlled these vast early shrines remains a mystery. Was there then an Andean equivalent to the Mesoamericans' Olmec? The answer is yes. There was a defining art style, the Chavin art style, which spread over an enormous area of the highlands and lowlands in about 900 BC, long after the building of these U-shaped shrines on the coast. This seems to have been a defining ideology, a defining set of religious beliefs, centered on a place called Chavin de Huanta in the Andean foothills. This shrine, with its terraces, was home of an elaborate, well-developed iconography. Chavin de Huanta itself, a terraced shrine, had a truncated pyramid, which was a hollow honeycomb of passageways and rooms. The center appears to have been a place of mediation between the heavens and the underworld. And here again, as in the Andes, as in the Mesoamerica, as with the Maya, shamans mediated between the living and the supernatural. We know that from the sculpture, where there were transformations of humans into animals depicted, they probably used music and elaborate costumes, appearing as jaguars, eagles, and other animals. At the same time, the priests could cause water to thunder through tunnels and channels in the shrine, replicating the link between the rain-giving mountains above the temple and the layers of the cosmos. It must have been a very dramatic performance with the water thundering through these channels. So much so that between about AD 850 and 200 BC, Chavin de Huantar was an important place of pilgrimage with a sizable population. But it never became a fully fledged state. And eventually, center of pilgrimage evaporated and collapsed. But its religious ideas endured. And they, again, were one of the catalysts for the development of civilization, both on the lowlands and on the highlands. After 200 BC, a series of wealthy states flourished along the north coast. The longest lasting and most powerful of these was the Moche state, which endured for 800 years. Its major centers and irrigation works lay in the Chicama and Moche valleys, and it became one of the first multi-valley states, and actually maintained loose political connections far down the coast. We don't know a great deal about the Moche, unfortunately, because many of the burials, which normally are such an informative aspect of coastal archaeology, have been looted. But thanks to a fortunate discovery in 1989, we have finally learned something of the remarkable rulers of this society. It was a society closely focused on intensive agriculture in the valleys and on the coastal fisheries. And it appears to have been presided over by a series of noble families, probably who were related to one another, which lived at different major centers. One of these centers was a place called Sipan, a major center in the Lambayak Valley, where in about 400 AD, a series of Moche lords were buried in their full regalia. They were discovered by looters, but fortunately Walter Alva, a Peruvian archaeologist, was able to move in and excavate 3 magnificent royal burials. The discoveries from these sepulchres, which are less known than those of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, in my view rival those of the Egyptian pharaoh, and in some aspects are even more spectacular. The 3 men were buried in their full regalia. They wore magnificent gold masks. On their heads were feathers and an elaborate crescent-shaped headdress which glittered of gold. They wore elaborate body ornaments in gold and silver, which represented the polarity of the world as represented as the sun and the moon. They wore cotton raiment, elaborate necklaces, sandals, and carried scepters. In a recent exhibition of the finds from the tombs, there was a mannequin of a lord of Sipan dressed in his full regalia. And they had a light playing on him, and the mannequin moved slightly. And you could imagine just for a moment what he would look like if he glittered in the sun as he stepped out of a temple high on the pyramid, and below him in the plaza would be a crowd attending a ceremony. And here was this man who appeared glittering perhaps in the setting sun, with the sun glittering off the gold plates on his dress and off his headdress. It must have been a magnificent sight, a living sun god. Who were these people? Interestingly enough, the thing we know most about the Moche is from their pots. Their pots, they were magnificent potters. They produced superb portrait pots of Moche lords looking serenely into the distance. But they produced them of fishermen, they produced them of shamans, of people engaged in day-to-day activities. And they also painted friezes on some of these pots in black. And using an ingenious photographic technique, which basically unrolls the pot by photographing it revolving on a platform, they can produce a flat version of the frieze painted around the pot. And Chris Donnan at UCLA has examined hundreds of these friezes. And among them are scenes of warfare, of people fighting and capturing prisoners. And there were scenes also of these prisoners of war being paraded in front of what appeared to be lords dressed in regalia remarkably like that found in the tombs of the lords of Sipan. Then you see the prisoners being executed. And you see the leader and others drinking the blood of the victim while the corpse was dismembered. And Chris Donnan believes that these men were warrior priests. They were the lords of the Moche, men of enormous wealth who controlled through food surpluses the work of very, very skilled artisans. Gold, silver, copper, pottery, textiles. These people not only had metallurgy, the earliest in the New World, but they also were magnificent craftsmen in many other gestures. But most of the population, of course, dealt entirely with day-to-day life. They were just farmers. Again, it was a pinnacle. And these people lived in isolation on the top of adobe pyramids, some of which were residences, other of them had temples. But, like Aztec and Maya rulers, the Moche warrior priests were well aware of the impact of theatrical ceremony and public appearance, where they would glitter in the sun like gods. But this society was very, very vulnerable. The wealth of Moche society was concentrated in very, very few families, a nobility who ruled from ceremonial centers at strategic locations in the valleys. But they were vulnerable. Why? 2 words: El Nino. We know that El Ninos descend on this coast, bringing with them 100-year rains. And in addition, sometime between 650 and 700, a great earthquake hit the coast. The Moche capital was at Cerro Blanco, near the modern city of Trujillo. 2 huge adobe platforms for palaces and temples, surrounded by irrigation works and extensive urban precincts. This great earthquake struck the Andes, blocked irrigation canals, and choked the river with landslides. The silt washed into the Pacific and washed ashore, only to be blown inland to form huge sand dunes, burying agricultural land. They probably lost thousands of acres just at a moment when a powerful El Nino devastated the coastal fisheries in about AD 600, bringing 100-year rains which swept away generations of irrigation and much of the capital. The capital was partly flooded, repaired, and then overwhelmed by sand dunes. So the great lords had to abandon their capital and move northwards, close to where the rivers debouched from the foothills, where water could be maximized. But only a half-century later, another El Nino descended on the Moche state, and a combination of this and probably competition from the highlands caused civilization to settle, to collapse. As Moche civilization came and ended, a separate tradition of small kingdoms had already developed at the southern pole of Andean civilization, near Lake Titicaca. And as Moche collapsed, so these civilizations began to come into prominence. This has told the story, this lecture, of the beginnings of Andean civilization from its 2 poles at the opposite end of the Andean world. We've described the maritime foundations hypothesis, which holds that the rich Pacific fisheries were a major catalyst for Andean civilization. We talked about the changes in spiritual belief at Chavin de Huanta. And then we've accounted the rise and fall of Moche civilization in the north coast. The major themes here are interactivity and vulnerability in a desert environment where you could only live by the coast or in the river valleys. And we'll talk about the later stages of Andean civilization after AD 700 in the next lecture.